Too often when we think about culturally responsive teaching, we think, oh, we're just talking about social justice, or we're just talking about race. But we aren't. We're talking about how was a child's brain wired. Your nurture culture, the first 0 to 5, your brain is wired to take in the world through a particular cultural lens. So understanding more about that is also part of that adult-child relationship, shaping of that lens.
Zaretta Hammond believes in culturally responsive teaching, and this is what she centers her work around. Culturally responsive teaching is not multicultural education, which centers on celebrating diversity. It is not social justice education, which centers on raising students' awareness on inequity and finding solutions to those inequities. Culturally responsive teaching is not a simple focus on relationship building. It is not an off-the-shelf program, and it is not a list of instructional strategies. Culturally responsive teaching is, first and foremost, a mindset, and it is much more of a process than a strategy. Culturally responsive teaching is about building students' brain power and improving their information processing skills using cultural learning tools. It is a focus on using culture as a cognitive scaffold.
So that you create a community of learners where that child sees himself as part of that inquiry, trying new things, making things, breaking things, and doing that in community.
A way to make culturally responsive education into practice in your classroom is to organize instructional activities around cultural principles. Three ways that you can do this is to gamify it, make it social, and storify it. A lot of times games are repetitive, you solve a puzzle, you make connections, and these are things that a lot of the times you'll find in oral traditions in the students' cultures. Also making it social. Organized learning so that students rely on each other, that will help build their communal orientation with all the diversity in your classroom. And the last way was to storify it, turn it into a story, a way that students can relate to the narrative of what is going on about the topic or the process or the text that you're presenting. This can be a lot more effective if you're turning it into a story. And then again, it brings in the culturally relevant oral storytelling that was passed down from person to person to person.
Making sure that our children know that not only do we have norms of behavior in the classroom, but we have norms of cognition. That if we get feedback, we also are making mistakes, and that those mistakes are information. They are not some reflection of you as a learner. That has to come from adults. We help children know whether or not that is the case.
Zaretta Hammond has made great contributions to the educational field. For starters, she wrote her own book called The Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, which promotes authentic engagement and rigor among culturally and linguistically diverse students. Along with that, she has also worked as a curriculum designer and professional developer at organizations such as the National Equity Project and the Annenberg-funded Bay Area School Reform Collaborative in San Francisco Bay Area. She has been a trained facilitator in anti-bias processes and has facilitated groups focused on learning to talk about issues of racial politics and privileges. She spent a majority of her time as an instructor at St. Mary's College in Northern California, where she taught adolescent literacy and trained tutors and parents in reading support strategies for struggling students of color.
A key facet of Zaretta's work is the idea that we need to move students away from being dependent learners. She argues for rigor and high expectations at all times, but she also notes that these expectations and rigor need to be anchored in relationships. It is this learning partnership that allows students to move from dependence to independence. A popular aspect of her research is the idea of a warm demander. A warm demander is a teacher that loves and respects her students, and through this, earns the right to demand engagement and effort. A warm demander is respected by students, and emotional support and instructional scaffolding to ensure all learners can meet the standards through productive struggle. By examining the chart she created, we can all as educators recognize our own assets and growth areas as we aspire to this educator stance.
As we learned more about Zaretta Hammond, we found that her ideas surrounding cultural responsive teaching reminded us of Dr. Chris Edmondson's reality pedagogy's instructional model. Reality pedagogy recognizes that academically rigorous teaching and learning are deeply personal. It begins with the understanding that a school's approach to teaching is unlikely to meet students' needs unless students' cultures, backgrounds, and experiences are reflected in the curriculum. When students see themselves in the curriculum, they develop stronger relationships with both their teachers and peers, and with the content as well. Zaretta's work builds on this thinking by ensuring that the culture of students is not just reflected in the curriculum, but in the approach and opportunities provided to students. Zaretta places greater emphasis on the why and the how of teaching than the what.
So being able to understand that we will get to equity when we give children permission to inquire, when we create spaces that will stimulate their brain, and when they have that level of intellectual curiosity.
Zaretta Hammond states that when operating from a deficit thinking paradigm, educators and policymakers believe that culturally and linguistically diverse students fail in school because of their own deficiencies or because their families don't value education, not because of social inequities, unfair school policies, or differential treatment in the classroom. It is through this lens, or aperture as Hammond would state, that she frames her ideas for building a better system of education for our students. Zaretta Hammond is at the forefront of truly going deep with the best practices for teaching CLD students. She develops and explains the science, provides tools and strategies for practitioners, and argues for education that truly puts students first. Her work will undoubtedly influence countless educators, no matter where they are in their journey towards educational equity and culturally responsive teaching practices.